Thank you for everyone for your presence to this panel discussion. And first, we would like to thank Matthew Saganik and Chris Bale and Ian for this brilliant idea about SICSS Festival, which I agree to continue our conversation that we start at SICSS and grow it to a bigger audiences. I think we were afraid about COVID pandemic to disrupt the way that we think that we work, but actually give us also some opportunity to do things differently, like we used to do it at SICSS. So that is very interesting way that we engage and change the way that we work with SICSS. And my name is Vissého Adjiwanou. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Quebec in Montreal, and adjunct professor in the Department of Demography at the University of Montreal. The subject that brings us together this morning is not new. Like in the other social science disciplines, there are a lot of work, research that is underway in using these new methodologies, new computational approach in our research. Demography is thus shaking in his head, but like past tensions, this one takes place for the moment without tension within the disciplines, because it takes the computational approach work in the other area of the discipline, not in the center of the discipline yet. Okay. So, as I said, this is not the first time that our discipline has been crossed by internal splits. We must remember the division between the proponent of a demography, which must claim its place and remain at the head of the discipline, like the demographer Dominique Tabitin, who suggests that demography return to its main object of analysis and focus on its core. He argued that the danger for the demography is to become different and multifaceted discipline. That is to say, without identity and autonomy. To this vision of demography, we can oppose that of Princeton, for whom the development of demography goes through its openness to other science, its transversality and its interdisciplinarity. In fact, according to Princeton, demography is made up of a nucleus and 4 satellites. That is data collection and its evaluation, studies on the causes and consequences of phenomena, social demography, and economic demography. Thus presented, there is no doubt that demography is above all an interdisciplinary discipline, which is gaining strength by bringing its support to other disciplines like sociology, economics, and statistics in understanding the phenomena that affect population, but also using these other sciences to improve their own analysis. Thus, from the vision that one adopts for the discipline, one can be very open or skeptical to this new development in the discipline. It seemed to us in this panel that demography would gain a lot for embracing this new development, because like other disciplines in the social science, it is by far the one that makes an important place for quantification and interdisciplinarity. Okay, just as it has developed tools to deal with imperfect data, massive imperfect data that we have today, like big data, must be an opportunity to renew our research in demography. In each of its area that you focus in the core of the demography or in their satellites, computational demography has started to make its contribution. To talk about it today, we have 4 SICSS alumni, including myself, who are members of this panelist, and the audience that is in front of us actually also, who we hope will bring us some insights and very helpful comment to go forward. The first panelist is Francesco Rampazzo, who is a ESICSS-funded PhD candidate in social statistics and demography at the University of Southampton, and doctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research exploring the use of digital trace data combined with traditional data source to estimate migration. He is a SICSS alumni from Duke in 2018. Our second panelist is Ridhi, who is Associate Professor of Social Demography at the University of Oxford and the Fellow of Nuffield College. She co-leads the strand on digital and computational demography at the Vissého Center for Demographic Science at the University of Oxford. She has been working on understanding how digital data and computational methods can inform demographic research and the implication of digital gender inequality for demographic outcomes in the context of low and mid-income countries. She is SICSS alumni from Princeton in 2017, and she organized SICSS in 2019 at Oxford. Our third panelist is Nicolò Cavalli, who is a DPhil candidate in sociology at Nuffield College, University of Oxford, and a postdoctoral researcher at Bocconi IFAMID Group, working on the intergroup relations and computational approaches to the study of identities and life course transition. He is SICSS alumni from Duke 2018 and co-organizer of SICSS-Oxford in 2019. So like you see, the panelists are all members of or alumni from the SICSS, okay? That didn't make you that you are not going to complement of what you are going to talk about here, because you are the five panelists of this discussion. So I'm not going to take more time. I will let the floor to Nicolò to start with his presentation to the group. Thank you. Nicolò, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Vissého, for this introduction. Let me see if I can also manage to share my screen. I have just a few slides. Share screen. Let me see. Share. Okay. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. So I just want to start off from just what Vissého just said, that like on the one hand, demography has always been dealing with big data, as in Francesco Villari and Emilio Zagheni in this paper that I am showing you discussed. So censuses were big data, especially when the forced data collection processes started. And in a way, so demography has always been on the frontier of data collection. The question, however, is whether we are facing now a, what Vissého referred to as a kind of like a drift in the discipline, or in a way, a paradigmatic shift. And Villari and Zagheni mentioned Kuhn and noticed that in the pre-paradigm period, there is an increase in the frequency and depth of the debates over the methods and the data. And from this point of view, we might be able to identify kind of like 3 or 4 main different kind of data paradigms in demography. So the first one, traditional, is the one based on relying on census and administrative records to count populations over time, and this is the age of formal demography. And it's like really the core of the discipline, which is a kind of a macro core. And then towards the 50s and 60s, with the rise of survey data and also statistical methods in the 60s and 70s with proportional hazard methods and with the work of David Cox, there has been a kind of a shift of the discipline towards this micro level approaches, kind of driven by theoretical considerations on life course decisions, and of course that was a very rich moment for demography, because it had the possibility to, in a way, incorporate a more kind of identity-based approach, cultural approaches in what, you know, was also then defined as the second demographic transition theory. Then what I will do in this very brief presentation is just going through a set of these approaches with a main cautiously optimistic message, which is that from what we see from the literature is that the use of digital trace data, or digital breadcrumbs, as we want to call them, contributed to both kind of censuses, or like the traditional macro core of demography, by you know, by using innovatively digital data to, for example, from these digital censuses and counting population, especially in contexts where they might be very difficult to count or to reach. And it also led to micro level innovations. So in a way, it could be that combining macro and micro level approaches could be, you know, the new step, and what could be in a way more easily done or helped with the use of digital trace data. So when Francesco and Emilio were writing this paper, I started a repository of the digital and computational demography papers. It's extremely, let's say, in partial. Let me share with you so that you have kind of access to. Let me do. Maybe I'll just put it in the group chat. Stop share. Sorry. Okay, so I think you should be able to see the file. So this is simply a list of contributions from digital and computational demography that I've kind of accumulated over time. Feel free to edit it and add whatever kind of I missed. Of course, this list of works in computational and digital demography is based on my knowledge and, you know, like network exploration of the papers that are listed, meaning network citation exploration, but it is for sure inadequate and a partial representation of the literature. But I hope it can be useful. And there I classify works in computational and digital demography going back to the traditional population equation, right? So we know that populations are governed by a quite simple equation. So population in time 1 is given by the people who were already living in the territory in the previous time period, plus births minus deaths, and then you have the migratory balance, which is of course plus immigrants minus emigrants. And one first strand of research in digital computational demography is focused on reconstructing kind of populations based on digital data, which is what I referred to earlier as a digital census. In a way, is reconstructing stocks of people based on the traces that they leave online and basically counting them, right? Of course, this is kind of comes with some methodological issues related to the fact that we have systematic bias in, for example, Facebook advertising platforms, which is a very popular source, increasingly popular source of data to count populations. And there are kind of fastly evolving methods of kind of demographic calibration based on ground truth data. So the idea is that you compare your digital trace estimates with the ground truth, which inform us on what the expected structure of a population, or the expected numbers, you know, in a way in each cell, and then we kind of we elaborate methods to estimate this bias and correct this bias. Among these kind of approaches, the post-stratification approach, also based on Bayesian methods, is increasingly popular. I think maybe Francesco Rampazzo, who has been working on these quite extensively later, will present something. And then there is this recent paper by Sen and Claudia Wagner's group on trying to repurpose, in a way, ways of thinking about errors in surveys, so in a total survey error framework, to adjust digital trace data. So these are all kind of important approaches and fast evolving approaches to bring, in a way, counts online to a semblance of realistic counting of population. Then there is the other part of the population equation, which is the flows, right? So how a population changes. And on these, there are kind of like several approaches. Here, digital and computational demography has been also incorporating micro theoretical elements, thinking about, as you can see, kind of how parents tweet about their life course events, and trying to get the sentiment of it, of the meaning of fertility, or the identities around fertility choices. It's of course one of the elements of population change that have been kind of studied. And of course there is mortality estimation as well, and this has been quite important, especially kind of like during the COVID crisis. So Vissého has a paper on how leveraging a phone for brief surveys might be a very promising way to get to the death counts and kind of vital statistics, especially in countries where typical vital statistics might be missing or non-reliable. And in general, we can see here Emilio Zagheni, who also noticed that during the COVID crisis, digital and computational demographers have been particularly active, not only mentioning the paper by Vissého that I just discussed, but work by Daniela Perrotta, Andre Gros, and Francesco Rampazzo and Jorge Cimentada on deploying surveys to study behaviors and behavioral responses to policy during the coronavirus, or Bruno Arpino, who's at Barcelona now, going back to Italy, has been deploying surveys to study fertility intentions in Europe during the coronavirus crisis. And from this point of view, these digital methods can be promising to kind of fill data gaps that might happen, or that might occur in specific moments in time. For example, in terms of research on deaths during the coronavirus crisis, you might remember these heartbreaking New York Times front page from May 24th, and one of the approaches that in computational and digital demography have been quite popular, relatively popular, to count or to generally estimate deaths and get information on deaths is the study of obituaries. There are several methods to first count, but also get into text analysis to try and infer some, social economic estimates or characteristics of the dead, or even the network by looking at the number of relatives who are listed in the obituary. And these might be, even in a time like this, promising venues of investigation to fill these data gaps that otherwise we might have. Finally, I am done, but there is like a third kind of like important strand, according to my classification, let's say, which is, for lack of a better word, maybe Ridhi will correct me on this. I just in the folder in the sheet I call the demographic digital research, or the idea that demographers take the kind of digital life or digital quantities as their outcome of interest and apply demographic methods to study online populations. So this is an example from Billary and Zagheni's paper, where I started from thinking about, you know, like the age distribution of Twitter users. We can think of the account creation as the birth, and then the termination of account as the death, and then we can use kind of like life course, you know, event kind of studies to see how you know, to infer characteristics of Twitter users, or to ask micro theoretical questions concerning, you know, interaction on Twitter and in networks. And of course, another important project, this is why I was mentioning also Ridhi's her digital gender gaps project, which leverages Facebook, and not only Facebook data, to estimate digital gender gaps, or gaps in access to technology, which of course in a paper by Valentina Rotondi and colleagues, including Ridhi, published on PNAS, I think last week, show that, you know, are important correlates to a set of, you know, life and empowerment outcomes. So to conclude, in a way, in my personal opinion, this third strand of demographic digital research is particularly exciting, because by leveraging digital breadcrumbs can, you know, properly and more directly link micro and macro level analysis into, you know, a fourth theoretical paradigm, where we might have data-driven discovery meeting, you know, theory-driven analysis. I think that's it. I think I can leave it to you, Vissého. I hope it wasn't wrong.
Thank you, Nicolò, for this overview on research that is done in the area of computational demography, actually. We turn now to Francesco and later to Ridhi to give us a real example of research that is done in this area with their own experience, their own research. Okay, so let's turn to Francesco for his presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Vissého, for the presentation, and hi to everyone, and thank you also, SICSS, to hosting us. So my PhD research is about migration research in digital and computational demography. And I will just give you a brief overview of how migration researchers are using digital traces data and why. So measuring migration is really challenging still, because we don't have good quality data on migrants. So the lack of quality is related to the fact that censuses, administrative data sources, and surveys have several limitations. Censuses might have a large coverage on the population and on the migrant population, but it's not timely. The censuses happens every 10 years. So this doesn't provide us with an information of a phenomenon that change quite rapidly over time. Administrative data sources might help in fixing these biases from the censuses, but they don't have the coverage of the entire population of migrants. And the surveys might also have a solution for having a more timely picture, but it really depends on the sampling framework of this survey and also of the questions that they ask to the migrants. So the main limitations of the traditional data sources are the fact that they don't have a matching definition of who is a migrant. They depends on the time of migration. Usually it's 12 months for a long-term migrants and 3 months for a short-term migrants, but this might vary across countries and data sources. The traditional data sources are not timely. They gave us a picture every year or with a lag in giving us this information. And they are not comprehensive in the sense that they don't give us the entire picture of all the migrants. So actually, I'm not there, yeah. Digital traces data are an opportunity for migration scholars because these data are geolocated, so we might be able to understand where these people are from how they use their social media or some other internet platform. They are cheap because the structure and the infrastructure where this data are collected is already there, and they are timely because we can download them down to the day or to the hour that we are interested. And also they are rich of information because this platform are collecting many other information about the people that they are using this platform. However, digital traces data are not representative and biased. So we need to think about methodologies, and already Nicolò was speaking about Bayesian methodologies or post-stratifications techniques to make this data almost representative of the entire population. And there is a lot of work from many scholars, and you've seen the list from Nicolò, that have starting using email or IP location, and now they are moving into using Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And this is a screenshot of the data that I'm usually using, and they are becoming more and more popular. This is a Facebook advertising platform. And here you should see it. So you see that on this website, we can understand how many people are living in the US, have recently been in this location, or have traveled to this location. And here we have the potential reach of individuals. We can disaggregate these estimates by age, by gender, but also by many other information related to education or relationship status if they are parents, so to try to infer fertility. So this is a really rich data set that through an application programming interface, we can use in our research and collect the data. The approach that I think is becoming more and more popular in computational social science is to say that we should not say that we can substitute traditional data sources with digital traces, but rather we should complement them to try to have a better estimate of what we are trying to measuring. And also, I would add that we should do a data assessment of these data sources because there is no perfect data, and we have to assess the biases in terms of definition, coverage, and systematic biases of both the data sources before trying to sum them to have a better estimate. And here there is an example from my PhD thesis in which what I'm doing is trying to combine the data from Facebook advertising platform with the data from the labor force surveys in yellow. And this is a European-wide survey that also estimates migration. It's in a way similar to the American Community Survey in the US. And in green, what I'm showing is the model estimates that is showing that there are more European migrants from Poland, Ireland, and Italy in the UK, but also that there is a larger uncertainty because we are not able to have a clear definition from this data. And usually digital traces data have been mostly used in high income settings, so in the US and in Europe, but myself and Ingmar Weber for the International Organization for Migration, we are starting looking at how we can use also Facebook advertising data in low income settings. And here I report on the left the Facebook penetration rate in the African continent, and we see that the Facebook penetration rate is high in the north and the south. And also from the Facebook data, we might fill some information about migrants from Africa, because the variable is actually supporting in 17 out of the 54 countries in Africa. And then to conclude, I wanted to say that also we have seen from the kind of literature review file of Nicolò that there is a lot of interest in estimating migration and repurposing digital traces data. And I think we will see much more about this in the future, because there are still many challenges to achieve. So with this data, with digital traces data, we might be able to expand the definition of migrants that is quite rigid at the moment, given the traditional data sources. But by trying to understand the definition, we might be able to fix also the biases of these data sources. At the moment, much of the research is about estimating stocks, but we need to do the shift to estimating flows of migrants across countries. Other points are that through this digital traces platform, we can survey migrants. So we can have ad hoc surveys that can complement the original survey that are already running in the US, in Europe, and other continents, and try to leverage this to have a more timely picture, since it's actually cheaper to run them on the social media platform. And also under the umbrella of computational social science, what I think is that we will see more collaboration with network scientists to expand the definitions of migrants by trying to understand the network of migrants. And all this information might be able to inform simulation through agent-based models about migration scenarios, but also support the migration theories that are already there. So in a sense, the fourth paradigm that Nicolò was speaking about. And thank you very much, and I give back to Vissého.
Thank you, Francesco. Now we turn to Ridhi for a presentation on gender inequality and computational demography. Thank you, Ridhi. Go ahead.
Thanks very much, Vissého. I'm very excited to be a part of this panel. I hope you can see my screen. So I'm very excited to be a part of this panel, partly because I think this is an exciting moment in time to be having this conversation about the role of the digital revolution and what it means for demographic research. And taking that as the starting point, I think my task for the next few minutes is to try and articulate from my perspective what I think the digital revolution means for demographic research and the kinds of research that demographers do. So in doing this, I'm going to draw on briefly two examples of some of the work that I've done with colleagues and collaborators to sort of highlight what I think is ways in which demographers can both leverage and contribute to advancing the digital revolution for demographic research. Before I go on further, this is a panel about digital and computational demography, so kind of implicitly I'm invoking that there's something new and exciting about the digital revolution for demographers and population scientists. So what do I mean by the digital revolution? I essentially mean the staggering diffusion of the internet and mobile phones that has occurred everywhere in the world. So here, this is data from the International Telecommunications Union. You see technology subscriptions per capita, and really see just tremendous pace of diffusion in red here of cellular connections. And we also see, of course, fixed internet connections in gray increasing, also mobile internet starting in the mid-2000s increasing. And this is not happening in one region of the world. This is really happening everywhere, right? So these data, again, from the ITU show that technology subscriptions, the diffusion of technology has been a global phenomenon, essentially not leaving any part of the world unaffected. And of course, the levels are quite different in different parts of the world. So there's a lot more room to grow, for example, in Africa and parts of Asia. But what we do see is that mobile and internet technologies have diffused. And as a result of that, many parts of the world in, for example, South Asia and Africa have completely skipped the landline stage of telecommunication development altogether. So what does that mean for, what does the digital revolution mean for demography? I think this is a two-faceted development, and I want to draw on two examples of my work which highlight both of these facets. The first is that the digital revolution is a social revolution, right? And it's a social revolution because these new technologies are changing the way we access information, the way we communicate with each other, we access new networks, we access vital services linked to the economy, our health. And because of these mechanisms, these are technologies that demographers should care about because they're likely to affect the outcomes and the processes that we generally study, right? So I think the first part of the enterprise of digital demography is to think about the ways in which the digital revolution has implications for demographic processes and behaviors and affect the outcomes such as health and well-being or gender equality and fertility and reproduction that demographers have been studying for a really long time. The second way in which I think the digital revolution is a new opportunity is that, as has been talked about already, is a data revolution. And it's a data revolution in some fields, this is talked about, or largely it's been talked about in terms of the big data revolution. But I like to think, and Nicolò already referenced this before, that demographers worked with big data before it became cool. And that's because, censuses have centuries-long histories. Administrative data sets such as vital registration in some parts of Europe have been in place since the middle of the 18th century. And essentially, these are large-scale data sets that effectively cover whole populations. So when demographers have generally thought about big, they've thought about full enumeration, they've thought about population representation and generalizability. The new question that new kinds of data sources pose is, can the new types of data that are available, that are also big in terms of volume, also be used for population generalizable measurement? And that's a question where I think demographers are uniquely positioned to contribute, given that we have a long history as a discipline of working with large, but often imperfect and faulty data sets and data sources, right? Another way of thinking about these new kinds of data sources is, can we leverage demographic approaches to understand the characteristics of online populations? That might be interesting both as an inquiry in of itself, but it's also important for us to think about that, given that increasingly researchers in the social sciences are relying on online populations for doing measurement, whether that's through surveys or through other modalities. We're using and leveraging online populations. So it's important to understand the demographic characteristics of these populations, especially if we want to make population generalizable claims, which in essence lies at the heart of a lot of demographic inquiry. So in that sense, in the first way, the digital revolution is a social revolution. Here's some examples from my own work. This is from a recently published paper with my colleagues in Oxford, McGill University, and in Bocconi University in Italy. And here we just look at, what does mobile phone technology diffusion mean for demographic indicators such as contraceptive prevalence or the gender inequality index. And on the left panel, you see that there's essentially a kind of an association here where great or improvements in mobile phone or greater availability of mobile phones is linked with reductions in gender inequality. This is exploiting variation by country over time. So we sort of assemble a macro level data set here, drawing on information from countries from 1993 onward, combining data from the World Bank, the UN, and other data sources. And we see that increases or wider availability of mobile phones is associated with improvements in contraceptive prevalence. And on the right-hand side, the panel shows that here this is stratifying the coefficient by quintiles of GDP per capita, that the biggest payoffs in absolute terms are in those places where that are most low income. So the least developed and the less developed countries by this economic development indicator. We find similar effects also for child mortality and maternal mortality. And what's interesting is that these effects for mobile phones are robust to the inclusion of controls for economic and social development indicators and across a range of different specifications of models that we try, right? So this is macro level suggestive evidence, associational evidence that technology has implications for the kinds of outcomes that demographers are interested in. Increasingly, there's some opportunity, although it's still at a very, very slow pace, where we have some individual level data sets that demographers generally use, such as the demographic and health surveys, that are now actively incorporating questions about technology use into the survey modules and questionnaires. So in the more recent waves of the DHS, the demographic and health surveys, there are questions that are asked of women in the surveys, women between the ages of 15 and 49, about mobile phone ownership. And here you see this indicator from 7 sub-Saharan African countries. And we see there's kind of variability here from Burundi, which has about 27% of women who own mobile phones, to Zimbabwe, which has 72% of women who own mobile phones. So these are nationally representative samples from the DHS. Now, what we're interested in is the DHS has this indicator, but also has a lot of rich information about reproductive health, about women's autonomy, and again, key indicators that demographers are interested in. And what we find is that there are robust associations, again, between mobile phone ownership at the individual level amongst women and a number of indicators linked to decision-making about contraception, equality in decision-making in the household, access to use of modern contraception, as well as information linked to health-related behaviors, such as knowing where to get an HIV test or antenatal screening. Now, of course, you know, for those who are inclined to find endogeneity everywhere, this is an endogenous variable. So one way that we get around that is by leveraging the fact that a lot of DHSs now provide geolocalized data for respondents or their households, and we link that to satellite data sets, which tell us where there are lots of lightning strikes. Where lightning strikes happen more, mobile phone antennas or the towers are likely to be affected, and as a result, connectivity and uptake is poorer. So we use this instrumental variable, and we find, even with our instrumental variables regression, on the right-hand panel on this figure, we see that a number of our effects are robust to the inclusion of this instrument. And as a result, plausibly, there could be a causal interpretation to these findings using the instrument as well. Even in the individual level analysis, we find that the biggest payoffs are in the micro level clusters, where actually that are the sort of the poorest. And there, in order to sort of control for other forms of economic development, we use a widely used indicator now in this data for development literature on night lights, observed again via satellites. So just to sort of summarize what I've tried to show here on this part of how the digital revolution is a social revolution, is that mobile phone ownership here is linked to outcomes that demographers generally are interested in and have cared about for a really long time. And the bigger payoffs are often at lower levels of economic development, or at least that's what we've been finding in the work that we've done in this area. So one implication of this is that it's important for us to track as an indicator, social indicator of interest. And indeed, it's also acknowledged in the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. It's important for us to track digital access, especially by gender of the user, which surprisingly, I've found is not something for which there's a lot of data available. So for example, here, this is from my project's website, digitalgendergaps.org, that Nicolò mentioned as well. We found by doing a systematic sort of analysis of existing data sets where we can analyze mobile ownership and internet access by gender of the user, that in many parts of the world, we don't have high quality population generalizable data sets that would allow us to say something about gender gaps in mobile access. Specifically here, we see large data gaps on this indicator in sub-Saharan Africa, also in parts of South Asia, and also in internet access. So we can't compute with existing available survey data sets that we would use for this kind of measurement. We don't have many survey data sets or any survey data sets available. And when they are available, they tend to be outdated and they're not updated at all very regularly. So one of the things that in our project on digitalgendergaps.org we're trying to do is to see to what extent can we leverage information on large online platforms such as Facebook, but also Google, and look at the demographic characteristics of users on these platforms and compute relevant indicators to predict this internet gender gap in a way that leads us to believe that this indicator is a reasonably good measure of the internet or the mobile gender gap. In this paper with Masumali Fatehkia and with Ingmar Weber, both of whom are more from the computer science background, we looked at how Facebook's marketing API, what Francesco also talked about, could be leveraged to generate this indicator, the Facebook Gender Gap Index, which is simply the female to male ratio of Facebook users over the age of 18. And we found that it was remarkably strongly correlated with internet access gender gaps from survey data that we had access to. The correlations were in excess of 0.8. And this, so we used it as a variable in the model to try and make this prediction. And we found that the prediction was improved when we combined it with other information on development indicators that are available for the same countries, such as on global gender gaps in education. So this suggests that, again, there's value, potentially complementary value, in leveraging these kinds of data sources for measuring social indicators of interest, but also for us to track an important dimension of social inequality that demographers perhaps, I think, should be caring about much more. So just to sum up, I think I see digital demography in three ways. And I think that this is the way that there's scope to move forward. The first way I think digital demography or the first set of questions that I think digital demography should try and address is understand the implications of digitalization and digital inequalities for demographic outcomes and behaviors. And that's a really important question that I think a lot of other social sciences have done well in addressing, but demographers have been slow to take up on. The second is, how can we repurpose novel sources of data, link the old and new for complementary population generalizable forms of measurement, really capitalizing on the fact that demographers have been really good over the years and have a long history of working with data quality issues and focusing on good quality measurement given faulty or imperfect data. And the third issue is, I think, is that we should be looking to do demographic analysis of online populations, not just to understand biases, but also more substantively understand social inequalities in new ways. So I look forward to having a discussion further on this panel. So I'll hand it back to Vissého now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ridhi, for this presentation. I think you all will agree with me that it is a very exciting time to be a demographer, or to start learning demography as a subject, as a discipline. So thank you for this nice presentation. So what should we keep from that is that you have been very successful to study migration, actually. Why migration? Because when you start demographic course, everything that you learn is about fertility and mortality. because it's where we have the data. We never have data in migration. And so we let the migration part of the demographic process to economists, to other disciplines. But now we have, I think we are in the process of revolutionize the study of migration in the demography field itself. And you have also seen this next presentation by Ridhi on renewed research on gender inequality in a very unexpected way, and many other topics and many other research that is actually done in the field of computational demography, like you can see it in the Nicolò presentation as well, and Francesco. So where should we go from now? I think there is a paper by Cesaria 2 years ago who summarized what have been our strength and where we should go, is to use traditional data with digital data to come up with a better measurement, a better understanding of demographic process should be one way to go. The another way is to use a demographic dimension in digital data to try to incorporate demographic aspect to those data and accounting for biases. We have been very good in the past to work with imperfect data, to develop new tools to work with those data. And then you freeze ourselves to not be able to engage in this new process. So try to accounting for bias will be something that we should start doing. And as a social scientist, we know that our main issue have always been about indigenous problems, indigenous biases, about endogeneity. And we have to figure out a way to do experiments, like Matthew said often, that you have to reimagine doing experimentation in the web to try to figure out what is the behavior process in demographic process actually. And most importantly, we have to reimagine our data-driven approach. Demography have long been data-driven discipline. It's not about theory that we are focused on, but now we are trying to engage fully and try to understand, to learn patterns from the big data that we have at hand. So we have to reimagine that and think about the way that you can work with those data. And those come with some challenges that you have to overcome. There are some challenges that you can look at as opportunities. The question about non-representativeness of ethics. Every time that we talk about with demographers, about big data, they will come up always with those issues to you. Non-representativeness is messy, and so on. Those are opportunities for us to work on because we have been successful on that in the past. And you have also to overcome some that is very challenging actually. It's because people didn't see the value added of what we are doing, okay? You have still in many places big demographic data, as we say it, okay? Administrative data are becoming more and more open to people. So they didn't see really quite well what is these big things have to add to us anymore. So as I think we have successfully do it here, show that yes, we have been able to do it differently, to provide more content in the way that we do research in demography. So this is very beautifully done here. And we have to think about change the curricula in demography. Okay, doing all those things, we cannot just do it with those success story with SICSS that we have run for the last 3 years, but you have to incorporate those methodology in the demography field. In 2012, I did my first class in introductory course in demography. And one of the core things that we teach students is about the data source that you use. And I tried to teach this class last year, and I discovered that it's not updated anywhere. The data source that we have to do is broader than what we used to have in the past. So we have to incorporate those type of interesting topic in the demography. And still you will think always about this great divide between the North and the South, between the well and the university and the less not so much. We'll make that we didn't embrace totally this new approach in the area. And of course the data accessibility as well. Those are the challenges that you have to deal with. I think if you want to make sure that computational demography or digital demography is not only a new satellite in the demographic field, but it takes root in the field itself, that it transforms the field. Okay, that we have to change the paradigm about demography and make sure that computational demography became the main root of the demography, because it affects all aspects of the demography, the core and the satellite. So on that note, I'm going to turn to the floor for comments and for questions to the group. And dear panelists, thank you for this nice presentation. So Matt, I will maybe turn to you for if you have some question from the floor, or any comment for people, we are open to that. Thank you. Matt, are you there? Do you have some question for us?
Yes, yes.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. So there are some people I see who have been typing questions into the chat window. And it looks like Ridhi has answered that. So if you have questions, you can type them into the chat window and I will read them out, because we realize not everyone has strong internet connection. If you would like to ask your question yourself over the video, you can do that as well by raising your hand. And I believe you could do that from the participants list. If you have any questions about how to raise your hand, you can put those in the chat as well. And Ian Lundberg and I will try to answer them. So maybe the panelists could talk more. I noted a lot of you talked about the traditions in demographic research and how those could be modernized. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the tension between being a computational social scientist and being a demographer, because it seems like those two fields prioritize different things and value different things. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how you see that tension in your own work. And then also if you see ways that each field could help each other. So what are ways that use important ideas from demography that you see being computational social scientists you wish they thought more about? And vice versa, what do computational social scientists have to teach to demographers? I think that'd be very interesting to the audience, especially because we have a mix of people who have backgrounds in demography and computational social science.
Thank you, Matt. Who want to start? Ridhi, you want to take over this question?
Yeah, I'm happy to take over this question. And I also noted that there's a question also in the chat window that we can come to, which pertains to training, which I think is also relevant to this discussion. So I think one of the goals in having this discussion was for us to sort of try and find ways to bridge these different communities, the computational social science community and those who are very actively positioned in demographic work, but at the same time identify themselves as digital demographers, but they want to try and find ways to engage much more with the computational social science community. I think there's actually great scope and there's tremendous, I think, potential for synergies here, partly because I think a lot of computational social science at the moment is very excited about novel sources of data or applying new kinds of methods. But at the same time, the kinds of issues that demographers, as I was trying to sort of describe a bit in my talk, demographers are very interested in, is this population generalizable? Who can we say this about when we are actually capturing this phenomenon of interest? And these are the kinds of ways in which sort of demographers, when they originally dealt with big data, were very interested in, right? They were interested in enumeration and generalizability. And I think that's, and there have been a number of techniques, both in the tradition of formal mathematical demography, but also in the statistical demographic tradition that has come on more recently, to try and find ways to creatively meld and repurpose data sets and data sources to generate indicators that are robust and make sense in a way that we want them to make sense. So I think that's something that, I think the field of demography and also digital demography has much to contribute in the discussion with computational social science. On the other hand, I think computational social science has a lot to contribute to demographic researchers by telling us the importance of recognizing why digitalization and digital society is an important thing for us to be paying attention to. You know, I think, so, I mean, the fact that the demographic and health surveys, this large scale survey infrastructure, only very recently started asking about mobile phone usage means that we've been sleeping while the digital revolution has been occurring in our lives. And we shouldn't be, because surely it's important for all its implications. So I think these two communities can sort of, you know, highlight the substantive importance of these topics to each other much more. And I think demographers have much to sort of actually share with computational social scientists and thinking about data in population generalizable ways. And I think part of that, just to sort of take on the question here that is asked in the audience by Corey Sparks, that I think training here is a key issue, especially when it comes to, you know, so first, how do demographers realize the value of these other kinds of data sources? Often we're taught how to deal with rectangular data sets, survey data sets, or census data sets, and we're good at handling those, but we don't know what to do when things are unstructured in JSON files, or we don't know what to do, how to make sense of the measures that we get. And I think this is where sort of actively sort of becoming more broad-based in the way we think about data is something that I think all active just demography 101 courses need to start doing. And that requires that we talk with other colleagues who are working with different kinds of data sources and actually sort of invite them into our discussions for introductory demography courses. And this is something that I've been trying to do in my own courses. But I do see that there's a lot of room for improvement here.
Yeah, thank you, Ridhi. Other colleague here want to add something to what he said, or it's fine. Yeah. Okay. I think one of the tensions that you have also is that we, as a demographer or trained as a demographer, we lack at the beginning all the tools that is there, and to maybe able to use those tools, we have to engage in collaboration with computational scientists. Okay, so there is a survey who said that people want this collaboration. We demographers, many demographers want the collaboration with other computational societies, other computational disciplines, and so on. But we lack the way to do it. We lack the discussion didn't take up because we didn't have the background to engage in this discussion, in this collaboration. Ridhi said that the data is JSON file. Work with JSON file, if you are a pure demographer, you never understand what is JSON file, what is XML file. So when you start the discussion, you lack the background for that. So it's why we think it's very important, at least me, that is very important that we think about the curricula that we teach for the new demographers to make them able to discuss freely and understand really well what is going on in the other part. We cannot just be blind about this whole data that has become available to us actually. Okay.
I mean, I think to your point, I mean, training opportunities, as I said, are essential in sort of, you know, making sure that we have a broad-based and a more fluid notion of data, right? And yeah, that's very important. And I think that's one thing that I'm learning from computational social science is to adopt that. But I think what's also important is that you know, demographers who work in this area, we need to bring this into our own conferences. We need to bring this into our own courses, and so that a lot of this work should be taking place in mainstream demographic venues, because I think there is value here. So I see some of this change happening, for example, in the PAA, which is the American Demographers Conference. You see that in the last 5 to 6 years, there have been a number of sessions, and a number of sessions on computational demography, on big data and population processes, all of these kinds of topics, they've really increased. And I see that as a positive sign of, okay, this is taking space within the discipline, so that the kind of critique that we would expect that demographers and the kind of insights that demographers would have is now taking place in these venues rather than taking place in, for example, conferences that were like, for example, the IC2S2 or others, where maybe demographers wouldn't go as much. So I think it's important it happens in the mainstream channels as well.
So there's another question that's come in on the chat, which I'd be happy to read. It's from Meng. Will some populations be marginalized by the wide adoption of digital trace? How to deal with this problem?
Yeah, very good question indeed. Francesco wants to.
Francesco
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I can try to respond to this. I think this is a problem. I mean, it's in a way, I mean, I think it's a double problem. So from one side, it's targeting minorities with digital traces data that we might have issues with this. And when we present, I think, the results about minorities, we should be careful about explaining the uncertainty about the estimates, but also to try not to produce any harm on them. But also in terms of ethics, so I think IRB in the US, so ethics committee in Europe, European universities should also address when we present our proposal the marginalization of some population. Also, I was thinking, I don't know if I'm interpreting the question the right way, but also driving from some research with other SICSS members that we have done on Kenya, some part of marginalization that we see is that studying the online population, we are studying in Kenya actually the highly educated population. So we are excluding from the picture all the rest of the population. But by understanding this, we can also try to understand, as Ridhi was saying in her presentation, digital inequalities of the offline population. And from this, we can drive much of these demography studies to understand digital skills, how people are marginalized, and which kind of minorities the digital revolution is actually creating in the population that are not able to have access to this. Yeah.
Thank you. I see 2 more questions that have come in, and also 3 more questions. And also, as a point of order, this Zoom room will expire soon. So we have about 5 to 10 minutes left. So how about I read the 3 questions? Each of the panelists could address one of those questions, and then we thank everyone for attending and wrap up. So just the so one question from Raquel, and it's great that actually these questions deal with some of the themes that we've talked about already. Any advice or tips for how to get started? Someone whose background is not in demography, but wants to be is interested in computational demography for doctoral studies, particularly someone from a region where computational social science is not very prevalent yet. The second question from, so again, how to get started. Second question from Ben, how do you feel about balancing digital demography's use of novel trace data with concerns about data privacy? So this touches a little bit on ethics that we heard about, but privacy is an important angle to that. And then finally from Nima, this is a question for Ridhi. One demographic question is how processes at the population level relate to decision-making at the individual level. I have this impression that your study using mobile phone data is offering a solution for integrating the macro micro level of analysis. Could you elaborate on that particular part of your study? So again, we have a question about how graduate students can get started if they want to learn more about computational demography, a question about digital trace data and privacy, and a question for Ridhi about the macro and micro levels of analysis.
Thank you, Matt. Maybe I will start with the first question, how to get started. Because that is a very good question, actually. And I will learn from my own experience, okay, from pure demography to social demography to get to the computational social science today. The point is that, and what we have tried, one way that I get interested on that is because as a demographer, I know the importance of the data. And I see those data becoming more and more available, more and more there. And I see some research. So I start just reading and working on, to try to work on those aspects. But one of the important things that happened is the SICSS actually, where in 2017, I participated in my first SICSS conference, okay? And where everything have changed. And that changed also my mindset in a way that I can train students. And so when I advocate a lot here about the training, is about it's also because I have tried to incorporate the training in my course. In first year course in statistics that I teach at undergrad level, I introduced already out to the students. Okay, so it's some small step that I start, but that is, I think, is very promising. You have people who is still reluctant about that, but it's the way that you can start doing it. But if you didn't have the chance to do that, where do you start? The SICSS that I have organized also in Cape Town is one of the SICSS where we give the place for people from undergrad level, from master level to start with us. And I always used to say that if you are at the master level and you start to engage yourself with this new type of research in digital demography, that will change not only your research, but that will change your life. It's the way that I say it. Because you know much more, you have much more information that you used to have where you stick only on the social demography. I don't know if I totally respond to you for where to start, but the best place is also this panel here, okay, to engage and to start the communication with the panelists, with other colleagues, read paper and ask questions to the people that read those papers will be the first step. But as a master student, I wish you to challenge your professor. Ask them questions about topic on big data, on computational studies. Challenge them because they cannot just tell you that they don't know. They have to figure out how to respond properly to your question about all those research that are taking place today. This is what I can say about that. Thank you. Ridhi, or I think we lost Nicolò. Ridhi, Francesco.
I just want to add that Francesco's put in a link to the IUSSP, the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population Digital Demography panel, and I think that's a great resource for the link to different kinds of training opportunities, such as at the IUSSP National Conference, international conferences, as well as training opportunities at other conferences. But I think to your question, how do you get started? My first suggestion would be to watch the SICSS videos that have been made widely available through the SICSS initiative. So I think one of the advantages of course, the digital revolution is that a lot of learning material is now available online, which if you have an internet connection means you can access it. So that's definitely one way to start. And I really sort of think that's a great way to at least get a sense of what people are talking about.
So I've put the link to the SICSS materials into the chat. I also want to add that all of the slides are available as well. And so if anyone is teaching demography, one of the themes that came up is to try to modernize our teaching. So those materials can be used for your learning, but they can also be used for your teaching. Those are all open access, and we hope that they will be taken by other teachers and used and improved to help bring these new ideas into demography.
I mean, I'm cautious of the fact that we are running out of time, but I just want to make sure that we address the other two questions, even if briefly. I also want to say that please feel free to reach out over email to any of us as panelists. We'd be happy to have this conversation over email. But on the point about what are the concerns about privacy and linked also to the ethics discussion, I think to Ben's question, I think you have to sort of take a holistic approach to thinking about ethics. And I think Matt's lecture in the SICSS curriculum is a great anchor for this. I've listened to it and found it very informative myself when thinking about ethics. And I think we definitely have to take into account data privacy concerns, especially when the data were not connected in sort of a standard mechanism of informed consent, as a lot of survey or administrative survey-based data sets, census data sets are. In some of our work, both Francesco and I, we deal exclusively in aggregates. So that's one way in which, of course, we get around confidentiality and privacy issues. In fact, the data that are available through a lot of APIs are often aggregated, at least the marketing APIs that we work with. So, with aggregates, these kinds of issues, I think, are much more muted, especially because the aggregates are based on numbers often of several hundreds, if not more. When talking about, the digital technologies are not just about passive existing exhaust data sources, whatever you want to call them. It's also about opportunities for new and maybe cost-efficient forms of data collection. When adopting those, I think, we always need to account for a holistic approach to ethical data collection that is also grounded in appropriate principles of privacy and data anonymization and so on. So I think, if we're doing data collection online, the same kinds of principles of informed consent apply, that at least at minimum we need to be thinking about when doing any kind of data collection on human subjects. So that's a kind of a broad response, but I hope that it gets at some of the issues that you've raised. And just to the last question by Nima that I see, we did try and actually use both individual and macro level analysis, partly because to in some sense, we are working with observational data, so we don't have a perfect design. But when we see findings that are consistent at both the macro and the micro level, that's one way of trying to establish credibility for your findings and reassure yourself that what you're finding is actually something that exists in the world. And so that's kind of an approach that in some of my work I've often tried to do, is rather than just relying on one data set, try and see if I can get the same question or answer the same question in different ways with different kinds of data sets that get at different levels of analysis. So that's one approach that I encourage a lot of my students as well to adopt, is that, we're never going to have perfect data, but we could potentially try and replicate our own findings in different data sets as one way to reassure ourselves about what we're finding as actually being something that is really there. So it's just a general principle for research that I encourage everyone to adopt.
Thank you, Ridhi. Thank you, Ridhi. And the panelists and the moderator offered us an exciting view into the opportunities and challenges that come from digital demography. And I hope you'll all join me in thanking them for a wonderful event.